Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It started on one of those quiet Sunday afternoons, the kind where the world slows down, the clocks seem to tick softer, and the coffee feels just a little warmer in your hands. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling across the floor like spilled honey, and the sound of my sister laughing from the living room made the whole house feel alive. We were hosting one of our usual small family get-togethers. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches, a few sweet things, and everyone's shoes kicked off at the door. I'm 54, and I've always considered myself steady, comfortable in my routines, calm in the way I move through the world. I've never been one for stirring the pot or even letting myself feel too much all at once. But that day, something shifted. My brother-in-law, Matthew, was helping my husband fix a wobbly bookshelf in the den. They'd been close since college, and over the years, Matthew had become something of a fixture in our lives. Reliable, friendly, quiet, but in a thoughtful way. I'd always liked him. How could I not? He was kind, good with the kids, and he never forgot a birthday. I went to offer them both a glass of iced tea. The den was stuffy, the window barely cracked, and the smell of wood glue hung faintly in the air. My husband was kneeling, fiddling with the bottom panel of the shelf, while Matthew was standing beside him, his sleeves rolled up and hands dusty. He looked up at me when I walked in, and I mean, really looked. It was the kind of look that lingers longer than it should. Not inappropriate, not lewd, just searching. Like he was seeing me not as he always had, but as someone else entirely. Someone separate from the roles I played. Not his wife's sister or Aunt Diane, but just me. I handed him the glass, and our fingers brushed. A small thing, really. But I felt it. An awareness, like the air between us had shifted ever so slightly. I smiled and turned to my husband, who was grumbling at a stripped screw, entirely oblivious. "Thanks," Matthew said. His voice was quiet, softer than usual. "Sure," I replied, brushing a stray hair behind my ear. I don't know why that moment stuck with me so vividly, but it did. All afternoon, I caught myself thinking about it, even while laughing with my niece on the porch swing or slicing strawberries in the kitchen. It wasn't what he did, it was what I felt. And I didn't want to feel anything, not like that. A week later, I ran into him at the local hardware store. My husband had sent me out for some drawer liners, and Matthew was browsing screwdrivers. We weren't expecting to see each other, and I think we both registered the surprise in the same breath. "Hey," I said, suddenly very aware of how casual I looked in my old jeans and a windbreaker. "Hey," he echoed. His smile was easy, but his eyes, they held that same depth. I hadn't imagined it. We chatted, light, polite, nothing too personal. But he walked me to the car, and as I was loading the trunk, he paused. "You look good, Diane." I froze, not because it was inappropriate, but because of how gently he said it. How sincerely. "Thank you," I said, voice quieter than I meant it to be. I wasn't used to being noticed like that anymore. Not in that way. At home, I found myself lingering in front of the mirror longer than usual, noticing the soft lines by my eyes, the silver streaks weaving into my chestnut hair. I'd always taken care of myself, but I hadn't thought much about being seen. I started questioning things I hadn't allowed myself to consider in years. Was I happy? Did I feel truly present in my own life, or had I been drifting through it out of habit and obligation? That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband lay next to me, snoring lightly, arm heavy across his chest. I stared at the ceiling, haunted not by guilt, but by curiosity. That one look had opened a door I didn't even know was closed. The next family gathering was at Matthew and my sister's house. Their place was always neater than ours, with scented candles and soft jazz playing in the background. I wore a dress I hadn't touched in months. Nothing flashy, just something that hugged me a little more closely, made me feel like a woman, not just a hostess. Matthew opened the door. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment they widened just slightly. He noticed. I knew he did. All evening, I caught his glances from across the room. They were subtle, respectful, but charged. A quiet acknowledgment passed between us, unspoken but undeniable. My sister bustled around serving wine, laughing, oblivious to the strange new gravity tugging at the edges of the night. After dessert, I stepped outside for some air. The evening had cooled, the air crisp with the scent of fall leaves and distant chimney smoke. I stood by the railing of the porch, arms crossed lightly. He joined me moments later, standing a polite distance away. "Beautiful night," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It is," I replied, my heart beating harder than it should have been. We stood in silence, listening to the faint clatter of dishes inside. The quiet between us was no longer awkward. It was full of something delicate, something neither of us dared name. "Have you ever," he started, then paused, "looked at someone you've known forever and suddenly seen them differently?" My breath caught. "Yes," I answered, barely audible. He didn't press further. He didn't have to. The understanding settled between us like mist. That night, back in my own bed, I thought about how simple it would be to dismiss it all. To call it a passing feeling, a product of circumstance, or maybe even loneliness. But something in me had stirred. Something too old and too honest to ignore. I wasn't falling for him. That wasn't it. But I was beginning to remember a part of myself I'd forgotten. A part that wanted to feel desired, seen, alive. And I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew it meant something. I didn't plan to see him again so soon. But life has a funny way of placing people exactly where they're not supposed to be, or maybe exactly where they're supposed to be, depending on how you look at it. It was a Tuesday, chilly and overcast, the kind of day that made you want to stay curled under a throw blanket with a book. I was heading to the pharmacy after work, hair tied up, wearing a coat that had seen better days. I wasn't trying to look presentable. I wasn't expecting to be seen. But there he was in line ahead of me, tapping his card against the reader with one hand and holding a small paper bag in the other. He turned around as I stepped forward. His eyes softened. "Playin'," he said, surprised but not startled. "Twice in 1 week?" I smiled, but my heart was fluttering. "Seems like we're developing a pattern." He laughed quietly. "I wouldn't mind that." We stood there for a moment too long. The cashier called me up, and I stepped forward. I thought that would be the end of it, just a strange, meaningful coincidence. But as I stepped out into the parking lot, there he was, leaning against his car, waiting. "You got time for a quick coffee?" he asked. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to, but because I did. We ended up at a small place tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore. It was dim and warm inside, the kind of cafe that made you feel like time slowed a little. We sat in a corner booth near the window, the steam from our cups curling into the air between us like something private. We talked about work, about his niece's birthday party coming up, about how my oldest had started seeing someone new. Harmless conversation. But every time our eyes met, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something. Like we were both waiting for a signal that neither of us was quite brave enough to send. He asked me how I was. Not the usual "how are you?" tossed out as a formality, but the kind that carried weight, the kind that invited honesty. "I don't know," I said after a long pause. "Lately, I feel like I'm watching my own life from the outside. Like everything is fine on paper, but I'm somewhere else entirely." He nodded slowly. "Get that." Something shifted after that. It was as though acknowledging our quiet restlessness gave us permission to see each other more clearly. The versions of ourselves we kept hidden beneath the roles, beneath the obligations, they were starting to come into view. When we left the cafe, it had started to drizzle. He offered to walk me to my car, umbrella in hand. We stopped by the door, neither of us quite willing to say goodbye. "I'm glad we did this," he said. "Me too." The moment lingered. He looked at me, and for a second I felt that old teenage nervousness rise up in me. I wasn't used to feeling that way, tingly, uncertain, hopeful. "I should go," I said softly, but I didn't move. His eyes held mine, and I knew. He was waiting for me to step back or step closer. I did neither. I just stood there, torn between the comfort of my familiar world and the quiet pull of something I didn't fully understand. "I'll see you soon," he asked, almost as if it were a question of possibility more than scheduling. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above the rain. "Soon." The drive home felt longer than usual. My thoughts tangled like tree branches in the wind. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I was changing. Something inside me was waking up, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. At home, everything was where it had always been. The smell of baked chicken in the oven. My husband watching the game, feet up on the ottoman, remote in hand. I walked in, greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, smiled, asked about the score. I knew how to wear the day like armor, but inside, I was unsettled. That night, I sat in the bath longer than I meant to. The water had turned lukewarm, and my fingers had wrinkled, but I didn't move. I thought about how many years I'd spent being the strong one, the dependable one, and how, somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that I was also a woman with her own needs, her own desires, her own story. Matthew had reminded me of that, not through anything explicit, not through anything even remotely inappropriate, just by seeing me, by listening, by looking at me like I mattered, not just in my role, but in my skin, in my silence, in my unfinished thoughts. The next few days passed quietly. I busied myself with errands, chores, anything to distract my mind. But every now and then, his voice would echo in my memory. That gentle, grounded tone. That question, "Have you ever seen someone differently?" I had, and I couldn't unsee it now. When he texted me that Friday, *K, would love to grab another coffee if you're free sometime. I stared at the screen for a long while. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already knew what I would. I typed yes. Let me know when, and hit send. I didn't know where this was headed. I wasn't even sure it was headed anywhere. But I knew it was real. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to feel something real again. He chose a place farther from town this time. A quiet little cafe on the edge of the park, with old wood floors and mismatched chairs that gave it a kind of charm most places lacked. The kind of place where people spoke softly and the clinking of porcelain felt like background music. When I walked in, he was already there, seated by the window, a paperback open in his hands. He looked up the moment the bell above the door jingled, and his smile, warm and easy, settled something in me I hadn't realized was stirred. "You look..." He started, then hesitated. I raised a brow. "Go on." Like you're glowing today." I laughed quietly, unsure of what to do with the compliment. "That's just the lighting." "No," he said gently, "it's not." The conversation was smooth, natural. We talked about books, music we used to love, stories from college years that we hadn't shared before. We didn't talk about my sister or my husband. That wasn't the kind of silence we broke. Not yet. He reached across the table at one point, lightly brushing a sugar packet toward me. Our fingers touched again, just for a second, but it lingered between us longer than it should have. I looked down quickly, unsure of what to do with the way my heart beat in my ears. "I missed this," he said softly. "We haven't done this before," I replied. He tilted his head slightly, eyes holding mine. Exactly. There was no script for what we were doing, no names for it. But I knew, somewhere deep in my chest, that something was unfolding, something tender, confusing, but honest. We walked through the park afterward, our coats pulled close, the cold air brushing against our cheeks. The path was empty, save for a jogger or two. We moved slowly, side by side, close enough that our hands would occasionally brush. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said suddenly, voice lower now. I stopped walking. "You're not." "I just," he paused, gathering his words like fallen leaves, "feel like I'm finally waking up from something. And every time I see you, it's clearer." I stared ahead, unable to speak. Not because I didn't feel the same way, but because I didn't know how to say it aloud. Saying it would make it real, and real things come with consequences. "My life hasn't been bad," I finally said. "But it's been quiet, too quiet, maybe, like I pressed pause at some point and forgot to hit play again." He nodded. "You deserve to feel alive." The wind picked up, and I folded my arms tighter. I looked at him, his familiar face, his kind eyes, and realized that I wasn't scared of him. I was scared of what he made me feel. Scared of how he looked at me like I was still someone worth looking at. We said goodbye in the parking lot. No hug, no touch. Just eyes lingering a little too long, voices softened to almost nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because my mind wouldn't stop racing. I sat by the window at 3 a.m., watching the wind dance through the trees, wondering how everything could feel so new and so familiar all at once. The next morning, I went about my day as usual. Coffee, emails, laundry, but it all felt muted. Like someone had dimmed the world, and I was living under a shade that hadn't been there before. When my sister called that afternoon, her voice chirpy and full of weekend plans, I felt my stomach twist. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because I hadn't been honest with her or with myself. "I think we might have dinner at your place next weekend," she said. "Sure," I replied, my voice steady, my insides not. After we hung up, I sat with the weight of it all. What would she think if she knew? What would I think of myself if I kept pretending I didn't feel something? Something warm, aching, and quietly alive. Later that day, Matthew sent me a photo. Just a coffee mug on a table, next to a book I'd once mentioned I loved. "Thought of you today." Simple, harmless, but it undid me in ways I couldn't explain. I typed and deleted at least 10 replies before finally settling on, "You always know when I need a smile." And it was true. He did. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't know how long we could keep floating in this space between silence and truth, but I knew I wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The next time we saw each other, it wasn't planned. It was my niece's birthday. Balloons, folding chairs in the backyard, paper plates stacked high with cake and laughter. My sister was glowing, fluttering between guests, and my husband was chatting with her neighbors about lawn care. It should have been just another ordinary day. But the moment Matthew and I caught eyes across the crowd, everything else faded into the background. He was holding a gift bag and talking to one of the cousins, but his attention broke the second he saw me. A faint, slow smile lifted at the corners of his mouth, warm, private, familiar. I looked away quickly and busied myself by refilling lemonade pitchers. But I could still feel him, as if his presence hummed quietly in the background of my every movement. I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew that something about him reached a part of me that had gone untouched for years. Later, as the party wound down, and kids were off chasing each other with balloons, I slipped into the kitchen to breathe. The soft clatter of dishes, the murmur of voices outside, it all blurred together. I heard the screen door creak open behind me, and I knew, without turning, who it was. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded but didn't face him. Just needed a moment. He moved closer, but not too close. There was always this careful space between us, like a breath we weren't sure we should take. "This is harder than I thought it would be," he said gently. I turned then, slowly. "What is?" "Pretending I don't feel something when I do." My heart pressed hard against my ribs. I leaned back against the counter, wrapping my fingers around the edge just to stay grounded. "We can't do anything about it," I said. My voice wasn't firm. It wasn't even convincing. "I know," he whispered. "I wouldn't try to change your life. I wish I'd met you at a different time." That sentence stayed with me for days. Even after the party was over, after the decorations had been thrown away, and life returned to its usual hum, I couldn't stop replaying his words. I wish I'd met you at a different time. Was it wrong to wish for that too? One night, not long after, I found myself walking alone. I needed air, space, something bigger than the walls of my quiet house. I wandered to the lake nearby, the moon casting silver ripples across the water. There was no one else around, just the rustle of leaves and the sound of my own uncertain steps. I sat on a bench and let the stillness settle in. I thought about my marriage, not broken, but no longer vibrant. I thought about the woman I had once been, before the years softened her into predictability. I thought about how Matthew had made me feel like maybe, just maybe, that version of me wasn't lost after all. And then I thought about choices, about responsibility, about love, the quiet, steady kind I had built my life around, and the dangerous, flickering kind I had stumbled into by accident. The truth was, I couldn't give in to what was between us, not without tearing apart the very fabric of everything I'd known. But I could let it change me. I could let it wake me up. We met once more, weeks later, for one last coffee. We didn't plan it. It just happened. A quiet table in the back, a long silence between us that said more than words could. "I'm going to put some space between us," I finally said. Not because I don't care, but because I do. He nodded, eyes lowered. "I understand." We sat there for a while longer. No goodbyes. No dramatic promises. Just two people who met at the wrong time, who stirred something in each other that couldn't be undone. When I walked away that afternoon, something in me felt lighter and heavier at the same time. I had let myself feel. I had let myself be seen. And I had chosen not to chase it, but to learn from it. At home, I sat beside my husband on the couch, our hands brushing. He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time in a long time, I looked back. Maybe I would tell him someday in pieces. Maybe I wouldn't. But I had returned to myself, and that was enough.